Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mechanical Muse Live. I'm Mark Tassin, your host, and we're going to be here talking today about all sorts of cool things, games, movies, role-playing games, but especially today, we'll be talking about Cool Name Goes Here, the role-playing game that we've been building to give away to the world so that anyone can use it for anything that they want to going forward. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with some of our usual things. Very quick mail call today. This is my latest mail call. Yeah, this is pretty amazing. It's like a little miniature Commodore 64, right? Did you ever play Commodore 64? If you did, you'll understand how cool this is. It's got a whole bunch of the games on it, tons of fun, not particularly expensive, really. I mean, it's 44 bucks for this, right? You can't go wrong. It comes with a joystick. Yeah, it's actually a great bit of nostalgia. However, I'm going to give you one caveat. I don't know how we played those games. They were hard, like trying to control down to the pixel like you used to have to do. Honestly, I'm not sure how I didn't like go completely bonkers and smash it at some point, because I've been trying to play these games. And I'll tell you, as cute as this is, there have been moments where I've kind of started to lose my mind playing Impossible Mission or Temple of Apshai. So anyway, but enough of the mail call. That's been going on. The other thing is the game night update. As you know, we've started a full campaign playing the Cool Name RPG rule set to play a full Ataltis campaign. That's what we're in the middle of right now. So the first couple of weeks, we only played with some not pre-gen characters, but quick gen characters, just to get us started and get everybody into the mood and get everyone used to playing Cool Name RPG. This week, we actually took the new rule set and built out full characters. And so I'll be sharing those characters with you guys once we get a little farther along here. But so far, it's going very well. Our heroes have headed into the Zemayan jungle where they're searching for treasure or valuable spices, whatever they can find. They've arrived at Jonas Port, this port along a small river, and they're heading off into the wilds to try their luck and see what they can find. They're hoping they're going to find some ancient ruins, because it's said that there are ruins in the jungle that are from species that no one has ever seen before or met. So more to come on that. But I will say this, the Cool Name RPG rules continue to work well. The magic system works well, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So without further ado, let me jump straight to spellcasting. So, as you probably saw, the spellcasting rules were released in the latest edition of the playtest rules. These spellcasting rules are designed to be very freeform from the point of view that we aren't locking you down to any sort of spells or spellcasting, but we're building a framework that we can now test within within the game context and find out how it works besides swords and armor and all the other pieces of the game that we've already created. So this is a really big piece that we're doing. And so let me show you, I've got a little bit to share here. I will show you the spellcasting page. If I can bring it up. There we go. All right, so here's our spellcasting page. So you can get a good look at it here. We don't need to go through every part of it in detail, but just to give you a little bit of idea how this works. All right, so that's what I'm going to start with, just talking about how it works. So I'm going to go through the steps, but before I do that, I'm going to make it really simple. This uses the exact same rules as everything else in the game. You add up your action score, the GM adds up the difficulty score, and then you roll against the difficulty score. And the amount you make it by is the effect. That's the gist of it. Again, one of the things we tried to do with this from the beginning was have a unified rule set that still feels rich and different when you're doing different types of actions, but which is the same mechanic underneath. And we've managed to pull this off here, and that's what's happening with spellcasting. So one of the things I do point out is that we included very little color text in this, right? We aren't trying to pin you down to, do your spells come from a patron? Are you weaving glyphs? Are you calling upon divine power? That's not our focus at the moment. Now, down the road, maybe we'll end up with a very different divine and arcane magic systems. However, they'll still be based on this core mechanic. Because again, that's the idea, is that everything's based on the same base core mechanic. It's all about how you use it, how you twist it, how you add a little bit onto the side of it to make it a little bit more exciting. And I think spellcasting is one of the first times we can really demonstrate that. So let's talk about what goes into casting a spell. First up, you've got your target, which is obviously who you're trying to hit. Now, we've limited a target to a living creature, an object, or a space of about 5 feet by 5 feet. One thing we haven't really touched on here is area effect, because we're not quite ready to go there. We want to see how this balances first and figure out the best way to, honestly, I haven't figured out the best way to do the math for area effect yet, right? Like what's going to be the fair way to do it. But you can choose multiple targets. So we do allow that. So you can pick a whole bunch of targets within your range of your spell. There are limitations to this, but we'll get to that in a minute. Then we have the spell description. Now, this is very important. You need to describe the spell you're casting. One of the things that we've had a lot of fun with, and that I would love to see us be able to turn into a good system that can actually be used on a regular basis at the table, and I think we're getting there, is the ability to say, we need light. And rather than the mage saying, I have learned the specific light spell, you could have a mage that says, I will create light using magic. And that's an important part of this for us, is that we wanted to create that, like in games where you see the wizard just sort of pull out whatever spell they need, like the old D&D cartoon, for example, even does that, right? I mean, that is archaic as it was. The reality is that you're able to actually see that happen in the game, and we want to capture that. At the same time, we want to be a little bit careful that first, it's not so broad that you're not really sure how to mechanically build a spell. And it's also not so mechanical that you take away all the color and the flavor. So this is very important, the spell description. This does put a certain burden on the player and the game master. But at the same time, maybe that's not your thing. You just don't care and you just want the mechanic. Go for it. That's fine too. So you have the spell description, but that brings us to the spell effect. And we're going to talk a little more about the description in a minute. But the spell effect is based on the basic actions, right? So if we go back up here, let me run back to the top, and I'm going to show you we talk about our action types, right? Advance, aid, assist, attack. I'm not going to go through all these right now, but these are representative of the different types of actions you can take. Well, all magic is, when you think about it, is taking an action at a distance using magic. It's really not anything more complicated than that when you come down to it. Straight up, you're just doing an action at a distance with magic instead of tools, and instead of using your skill at doing the action, using your skill at casting spells. You're basically bending reality to your will using only your skill with spell casting. And so if you look at your spell effect, all of those actions are perfect spell effects. Assist, I'll give you some examples later, but we have like bull strength, right? That's an assist. You're helping someone to be more effective. You could reduce or increase the difficulty score for an enemy. That's basically a defense. And so all of a sudden, all of these spells that we know and love start falling very neatly into these categories. And then you start to realize you don't need to have everything predefined. Now, I do have a rule for this that I think is going to make it kind of fun to have these predefined, but we'll get to that. Keep teasing things, but trying to get through it in a logical fashion for you. So we've got our difficulty score set by the game master. Now, the difficulty score is based initially, the starting difficulty score, on the range. And we'll look at that in detail in a second. Then you determine your action score. You add up all the things that are in your favor. The GM has added up all the things working against you. And then you make your action check roll, just like any other action check. On a success, the spell is cast. You get your effect. On a failure, though, this is where we're taking these rules. And remember when I was talking about twisting the rules just a little bit to use the exact same rule to get a different effect? Well, in this case, if you fail to cast your spell, there is a cost. The benefit of being able to do just about anything with magic, or at least try just about anything with magic, even if you don't have the tools or the skills, the benefit is that, you get all of those things, but then the negative consequence is that on a failure, your character takes damage, and they take mind vitality damage, including wounds, if it does enough damage, equal to the amount they missed by. So what this means is that it's a self-regulating system where your character can try to cast a spell that's really hard and maybe beyond your skill or something that you're not very good at, but the more difficulty you add, the greater the risk to your character. We also added the concept of spell mishaps. We haven't used critical failures yet. I only want to include critical failures if there's a situation that makes them really fun, and this is one of those. On top of that, the critical failure is kind of a punishment, right? In this system, magic and spellcasting has an advantage over other types of actions, and thus I wanted to add an extra layer of risk. And so not only could you just fail, but you could critically fail and have a mishap. And so we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So that's the basics of spellcasting. Like I said, it's the same basic rule set that you're used to. It's the way that everything else works, and you're using the same action types even. So let's talk a little bit about the details. So we've talked a little bit about targeting, that you can have a object, a person, a space, a 5 foot by 5 foot square. Now, we've been using this 5 foot square concept for now, just as a way to sort of handle basics of things like an ice spell or something like that. And we'll come back to that. And it's not a perfect way to handle area effect yet, but we're working on it. Because the way that multiple targets work is, if let's say you want to cast a bull strength spell on all of your friends, you could then choose the character that's the farthest out to set the difficulty score, because that's going to give you the highest possible difficulty score. Or if it's multiple targets you're attacking, the highest defense score, and that's going to serve as your starting difficulty. And then you're going to add +1 for each additional target. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but in Cool Name RPG, we're dealing with a pretty tight range of numbers, and +1 per target can add up very quickly and add a lot of risk to your spell. Because remember, if you go under, you're literally taking damage that you're going to have to heal later. So that's the way that it works for targeting and for choosing multiple targets. Now, if you have a willing target, you don't have to add their defense score or anything like that. But if it's at range, you still have to use the range modifier, the starting difficulty score based on the range, because you're doing something at range that normally you could not. And that's the whole point of it. All right, so spell description. This is very important for a key reason that is mechanical, even though it might not seem like it at first, right? The spell description might be something like, I'm casting a bolt of fire that shoots across and strikes the enemy to, light him aflame and burn him terribly and reduce his challenge rating or challenge score at the end of the day. The thing about it is that the better you describe the spell you're casting and what it is you're looking to achieve, the easier it will be to know what components are appropriate. I don't know if you guys could hear that, but my dogs are having a field day over there. It'll help determine what appropriate spell components are. It'll help determine what the effect is. What sort of effect? Is it an advance? Is it an attack? Is it a defend, an assist? It'll help you to figure that out, and it'll help to figure out the difficulty score, because the game master will then be able to come up with things to say, well, you're going a little bit beyond just doing damage, so I'm going to add an additional +1 difficulty score. And we're going to be providing a chapter that didn't make it into this, but a game master chapter that's going to help give game masters some guidance on how to set these. All right, so you've got your spell description, and it can pretty much be what you want it to be. And I always say to start with a spell description and think about the why, right? So you might say, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to cast a spell on the bad guys. And the GM goes, what spell? You go, a fire spell. And he goes, why do you want to cast a fire spell? Say, to damage them. Well, that's an attack. We know what it is. So again, that's part of the thinking. And so that gets us into the spell effect. Now, as we said, you can use any of the spell effects, any of the action types that are listed under actions and action checks. And so I really encourage people not to start from there, though, right? Don't start from action types. Start from what you imagine happening in the game, and then grab the pieces that make that happen, right? That's a better way to play Cool Name RPG in general, in my opinion and my experience, is to tell the story you want to tell, and then look at the pieces, and you can very quickly put that together. So if I say, I want to cast a bunch of grease across the floor in front of our enemies, and the GM goes, well, what's the goal here? Say, well, then it'll be slippery and it'll take them longer to reach us. It's like, oh, okay. So I'm going to say that this is an interact, and that what you're doing is you're making the ground more difficult to cover. So an approach on your characters will take a major action. And I'll give you the difficulty score of that initial space and the initial distance, and you go ahead and roll. And so what we've got here is we've got a cool story effect that drives the rules, rather than rules driving story effects. It's might seem like a mild nuance, but it's actually makes a pretty big difference in the feel of the game that you're playing. All right, so looking at that, we've got our spell effect, and we've talked a little bit about that. Next up, we've got our spellcasting action check. Now, the action check is dependent on the type of spellcaster you are. One of the ideas here is that this allows us, you'll remember from the start, we wanted all attributes to matter. Otherwise, why have them? Well, this is one of those things that makes all the attributes matter. Each type of spellcaster is using something different to cast their spells. The wizard, their intellect, the sorcerer, creativity, the cleric, empathy, and the druid, awareness. This allows each of these characters to be unique and different in their own way and have a different approach to how they're creating the magic. And so that's one of the first steps here. Now, one of the limitations we have that I got a little flack on right off the bat, which is spellcasters can only have a single MO. Here's why I did it. I almost put in a design note, and I regret that I didn't, because it was literally one of the first questions that came up. The thing is that I don't really, at this stage of playtesting, I'd like it if everyone didn't have one level of spellcaster. Now, that could be a very cool style of game. It's kind of an Earthdawn style game where magic is everywhere and in all the things you do. Could be very cool, but it's not quite what we're going for. We kind of want spellcasters to be unique. If you're a spellcaster, you cast spells. If you're not, you don't. And so for that reason, we put this limitation in place. It is completely artificial and arbitrary. I admit that up front, but it should help us to balance the testing of the game and the rules as we figure out the best way to encourage people to focus on what it is they want to do well, as opposed to saying, well, I'll grab a little of this and a little of that. Again, it's not that I mind that, but if that's the best way to win, then everyone's going to do it, right? And so we want to be a little careful. It's the same reason why we broke out defenses to different physical abilities, because we wanted to make sure that across the board, each of these physical abilities, none was like the uber ability that everyone had to take, right? All right, so talked about the primary attribute. Focuses and specializations are pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about MOs after this for a few minutes, but we're talking about a spellcasting focus. We're talking about a type of spellcasting, and you'll notice that our spellcasting specializations are not too specific. For example, you could have elemental specifications: fire, earth, water, avatar. I don't think I'll ever name the elements without thinking of the avatar again. But anyway, you might have an element that you're especially good at. Now, is that going to limit you? I don't think so, because if you're really creative, you'll find ways to use your element more often. And what's cool about that is that this is how you end up with a group of fire wizards who this is their expertise and their specialization. They cast fire spells and they do all sorts of cool things. They can fly with fire by shooting it out of their hands. They can use it to destroy things. They can use it to repair things by sealing things together. There's all sorts of ways that you could use fire and heat. And as a result, it allows you to create this very unique character who would be totally different from a wizard that was sort of a generalist, or a wizard who was focused on water. Each of these characters are using the exact same rules, the same MOs, but they're very distinct and different in the way they end up playing the game, because the game hopefully encourages them to play it in that fashion. So that I'm pretty excited about as well. Of course, action score modifiers are still a thing for spellcasting checks. Two primary ones are spellbook, which you don't necessarily need a spellbook. But the idea here is that your spell book could be a prayer book if you were a cleric. It could be a group of stones with runes on them. But the idea is that if you get it out and you have it in front of you, it gives you a +1 action score modifier. And then the same thing with a magical focus. And we've listed different focuses for the different wizards or different spellcaster types in the MO section. Now we get to the difficulty score. And by the way, GM, of course, can add all sorts of other things, especially one thing I think is going to be a big one is unique spell components, right? So I would love it if a wizard comes across they defeat a red dragon and they peel one of its scales off, and then he shaves it down into a powder and uses that for his fire bolt spell in the future. How awesome is that? If someone does that, the GM should be, yes, absolutely. You get a +1 action score modifier. It's It's awesome. Your character thought about this long ago. You prepared it. You brought it with you. It's your precious spell component. That's an extra special spell component, way cooler than sulfur or ash. So that's one of the things that I hope that people will do as well, is think of creative ways to improve their chances as they're casting their spells. Now, difficulty score. Difficulty score right now is based on how far away the target is. Now, you probably know we don't have movement or range yet in the game. Even now, we don't quite have it. It's okay. It's been working fine. But what it means is that in terms of starting range, we have to be thoughtful about how we describe this. And so we came up with a rather general way of describing the distance. You've got self, which is just you. You've got reach, someone that you can reach out and touch. You've got across the room. You've got a stone's throw, so about, good distance that you could throw a stone, a bow shot away, and then you've got anywhere within view, right? So the whole idea is that your starting difficulty score is based on this distance. It's the distance at which you want to create an effect within the game using magic that you aren't able to do, that you would normally have to do by being right there, right? So target defenses. This is going to be dependent on the spell you describe, right? If you're describing a spell that fires a blaze of fire at a target, they could probably dodge it, right? Or use their defense score if they're an NPC. So as a result, the game master is going to come up with the most likely defense for the target. In the same way, if something's attacking you, right? Now, let's say you've got a shield and someone fires a firebolt, you could certainly use your block, put the shield up, let the flame hit it and shoot out the sides and everything, but you survive, right? So absolutely, you could do that. You could have your shield, you could dodge it, block it. But again, it's really going to be up to the players at the table and the game master to choose the right defense to build the difficulty score, to add to the difficulty score. Now, you'll notice what this means is that attacking someone with a touch not only incurs a defense penalty, right? So not a penalty, but adds to your difficulty score. So for example, a goblin, if it had a defense 4, you're already going to have difficulty score 4, and then the reach is 2. So you're looking at 6 already. This isn't terrible. If it's 2d6, that's actually about a 70%, 65% chance. So you've got a good chance, but you still might miss. And I think that this is why it's been working well, is you've got this good balance where when you add the pieces together, you end up with a score that is self-limiting, right? So things aren't out of balance and out of whack with the person who's got the sword over there, right? Because they don't have these extra disadvantages of the distances. All right, so moving on from that, normal conditions. You'll remember that all of our difficulty scores in Cool Name RPG are based on normal conditions. So what's a normal condition for a spell? Well, one of the things that was in here originally, I'll tell you guys about it because we pulled it out before it ever got to you through our internal play testing, was spells are meant to be cast in a ritual fashion in a wizard's tower or a temple or something like that. I love this idea, but it ended up meaning that everyone, because if you don't have one of these conditions, you end up with +1. It ended up meaning you were always adding +1. And at that point, what's the point, right? It should have just been built into the difficulty score. So we dropped that one. Instead, you could maybe get an action score advantage, or your wizard's tower could actually have its own score, right? A spellcasting score of its own that always adds the way, say, a magic item would. So it's not a modifier at this point. It's literally one of the things that's helping you. So that's going to be a lot of fun to add in as well. So now looking at this here, uninterrupted, you know, the usual in role-playing games. Can't have someone beating you with a stick. You can't have be on the back of a wagon that's rocking back and forth. All these things are going to add to your difficulty score. Verbalization is important and required. Gestures are required, and spell components are required. Now, I recognize that not everyone will want spell components required for clerics or maybe at all in their game. These are things that people can change if they want to, but we're trying to set the baseline for the core rules, and we're hoping to find out if this will work as a baseline for it. Now, help from others. About spellcasting, you can't really get help from your warrior on your spellcasting roll. They're not really going to improve your action score when you go to cast a spell. But if you've got another wizard in the group, you guys could team up to cast a spell together and have a better chance and less of a chance of taking damage. Now, keeping in mind that Although we don't call this out specifically, this means that if you're casting a spell and someone else comes and assists you, if it fails, you take the damage, but they do not, right? You'll end up getting the mind vitality damage or whatever spirit vitality damage if you're like a divine caster or a druid. And so the whole idea here is that you can still get help, but you certainly do still have that risk. It doesn't take the risk away. It just makes it less likely that you're going to fail. Which brings us to spell failure, which is actually going to knock down your vitality. Now, remember, vitality is temporary loss. You can literally stop if you take mind damage because your spell went badly. You can take a round and do a recovery. Do a recovery, sit back, compose yourself, get a few points of vitality back, and then get back into the fight. Again, this was the idea of the game, was that it creates this flow of you lose some points, you take a second, you're playing, you're whittling them down one by one. Are you going to risk being incapacitated, or do you stop to rest? What's it going to be? How are you going to handle it? And then all the while you have wounds on the side, which you're going to have to deal with at some point, and which when you take them, you're still making death checks. You could literally die from casting a spell. No, you probably won't, but you could. And I think that that's kind of interesting too. Now, remember, when you fail a death check, you don't die. You are dying, and other people can run in and help you. But the risk is there. And again, I think this risk balances nicely with the fact that you can kind of do anything you want at range, whether or not you're trained at it, with the benefit of your MO. So it is a very cool thing. One thing that we've built out that I'm not going to show you tonight, but I actually been building out some healing spells, which take the form of spells that recover vitality. This is just, if you remember the rules, a first aid check, right? You're doing a first aid check to raise your friend's vitality back up. You're just doing it at range using magic. That's all a healing spell is. And so if your fighter is getting pummeled back and forth up at the front, you could be casting spells at reach or across the room to help bring their vitality back up as you're casting. And so it creates this situation where the spells you're casting have a direct and very real impact on the game. And you're also not sitting there going like, well, I've got one spell and it's light, so I guess I'm out, right? That's one of the things we wanted to avoid. We wanted to make sure that each character class can stay active and in the game at all times. All right, so going on from there, spell mishaps. If you roll ones on all the dice, you have a mishap. Now, obviously, this becomes a bit more likely if you're only rolling one die. So if you don't have a very high action score and you've got a high difficulty score, you're going to probably hurt yourself, and maybe hurt yourself badly. Now, the mishap table is a variation of the mishap table used in the world of Ataltis. It doesn't mean we have to stick with this or that we have to stick with that table, but it felt like a good place to start on this. Now, one thing that I've added is spell duration. Spell duration is very important to have in the game. This is one thing I added the last minute before this went out because we realized it wasn't in there. Most spells, or many spells, are instantaneous. A firebolt that just burns you is instantaneous, but some spells you want to maintain. So here's the fun thing about this is that spells that you maintain add +1 to the difficulty scores for everything you do. So you can maintain a bunch of spells, but everything becomes very, very difficult for you while you do it. Now, what could be fun with this, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of this in play, and test it works very well, but I'm looking forward to seeing in play where someone casts, say, a defense spell on a group of people, their friends, and then they maintain that spell, right? Now, things like injury can cause you to lose a maintained spell. You can purposely choose to drop a maintained spell. So there are, it's not permanent, but it is something that's very cool that you could have up and running all the time. Now, one way to make a spell easier is ritual casting. The idea of ritual casting is that each time increment you move up the table, spells are by default 1 turn. Each time increment you move up the table, you move 1 increment down the difficulty table, right? So let's say I had a spell that I'm casting at Stone's Throw, and that takes me 1 turn. Well, I'd like to get that 6 down to a 2. So what I'll end up doing is moving 2 steps up the table and taking 15 minutes to cast it. What we're capturing here is that when you aren't in the midst of combat, you usually take your time to make sure that you can get that spell off without injury and harm, right? So the idea is that it also means that if you wanted to cast a spell as far away as you could see, you're probably going to want to increase the time by quite a bit, because otherwise that difficulty 12 is going to be tough to pull off, right? And so you'll want to bump up those numbers until you get that difficulty down low enough that you can actually get the spell off without injuring yourself. And so this is a great way to do things like a clairvoyance spell, where you cast it at line of sight at the castle so you can look down over the walls, right? So one other thing I wanted to show you tonight, and this is something that's not in the new rules yet. Well, I'll just show mishap table is here. Again, I'm reminding everyone the mishap table is an example of mishaps. They're not necessarily the ones that the GM wants to use all the time, because otherwise you start hitting some of the same ones. But that's all here. You also are adding your difficulty score when you roll in the mishap table. So the higher the difficulty, the more likely you are to get the crazy mishaps. So you want to be a little careful. The more difficult to spell, the more likely you are to have bad mishaps. This is what I wanted to show you tonight. We are putting in a set of sample spells. I've been working on these. We didn't have them in for this play test, but I'll be releasing these on the Discord channels. I'll be releasing them to our Kickstarter backers. But what these are showing how we build out spells. And why this is important is that we're not just giving you spells you can cast, but we're walking you through how and why we built it, right? We wanted you to know why we built the spell the way we did, to serve as a model for you in building your own spells. So let me just look at a couple of these. Let's start with, here we go, Arcane Bolt. So Arcane Bolt, where you fire a missile of magical origins at your foe, in this case is one living creature, but it's basically firing a bolt of energy, right? Magical energy. It's not meant to like burn out their mind or anything like that. You're just striking them with magical energy to do harm to them. So range for this, we preset this as across the room, because that's usually where your targets are when you're using this spell. So preset it as across the room. Target is a single living creature, and the defense score is the target's defense, as well as across the room. Okay. The duration is instantaneous, means it just goes off. And the casting time is a major action, 1 turn, right? And the type is the action type. This is based on the attack action. So what we've done here is we've given it a cool description, right? A bolt of blue energy streaks from the spellcaster's fingertips towards the target. The spell reduces the target's challenge rating or body vitality by the effect. Armor protects. Okay. And then we listed a spell component that we thought was appropriate. So this is a standard ranged attack, just like firing a bow or throwing a dart. Same thing exactly, same basic thing. But you don't need the bow. You just create a magical effect. You don't need the dart. And you are using your spellcasting as opposed to, say, coordination to try to hit that target, which spellcasters often don't have great coordination, right? So what this is we're describing how we built this out so you'd get the idea. So now let me show you another one, though, that's a little bit different. Light. So the light spell is tricky. And why is it tricky? Well, it's tricky because it doesn't really fall into any of the action types, except maybe interact. Now, when you do this, you create light. The range is reach. The difficulty score, because it's reach, is 2. I actually have to go back and fix this one, because this should actually say target defense plus across the room, which I believe is a 3. So difficulty score is a 2, and the duration is maintained. In other words, as long as you keep it up, it'll keep glowing away and lighting the room for you. So now you ask yourself, like, well, this doesn't seem very hard. Any wizard can do it. They don't even have to really try. They can do it as much as they want. And to that, I'd argue you're right, which is exactly how a torch works. Anytime you want light, you light your torch or your lantern. Anytime you need it, it's right there. There's no real risk. You don't have to make a roll even. And so in this case, the wizard at least has to make a roll, risks maybe a mishap in order to do something without any supplies. And so that's why in this, we want to make clear that, look, it doesn't always have to be hard. It's okay if magicians just and spellcasters just do stuff, right? Because look, if they're just going to say, okay, I'll do it in a mundane fashion, you've just lost what made great having spellcasters in your game, right? If they're like, well, then I'll light a torch and you get the exact same game effect, why did you block them, right? There's no point in blocking people. And so that's one of the things we try to encourage and talk about here as well. Now, let me show you this one here, Arcane Shield. This one's a little bit different, all right? So this one is a spell that the wizard casts on themselves. It causes a glowing shield to appear that they literally are using like a shield, all right? So they're casting it on themselves. The difficulty score is 0, but they have to maintain it in order to keep it going, right? And it's a major action. And this is an assist type. So this is basically the same as doing a defense action on yourself, but you can do it without having to do a defense roll using your physical capabilities. And so what we ended up doing was using it as a defense action, applying the effect to the block score and giving the wizard a block score, because the wizard is taking a somewhat of a risk, not a huge risk, but a risk, and all their actions going forward will be harder. And so what this does is it gives them the ability to block attacks, and at the level of the effect added to their block score. We'll see how some of this works. I'm a little bit concerned that we need to add a higher level of difficulty to the, like maybe bump all the difficulties down one, but I also don't want to make it so hard that it ends up being too hard and it breaks it right off the bat. I'd rather it be too easy and us have to rethink it a little bit. But it's just a great example of where we decided that giving a block defense was a reasonable advantage to offset the risk of inherent in spellcasting. So that's my talk on spellcasting. I'm going to pause on that for a second. Of course, if you guys have any questions, feel free to jump in and let me know. But the spellcasting is really coming along nicely, and I'm pretty darn excited about how it's all coming together. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about just very briefly tonight is building MOs. And the reason why I want to talk about this is that MOs have been incredibly popular, especially the idea of building your own. Like even in our game, 2 out of 3 players on one night that were there were building their characters, wanted to build their own MO. They were super excited about it. And so what we're finding is that this is something that really appeals to people and seems to make the game a lot of fun for folks, and yet doesn't break things, which is really nice, is a nice part about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it takes to build an MO and what we thought about when we were building the MOs that we were doing as samples for you. So let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. So an MO is a vision of a type of character that exists in the world. That's one of the first things you should think to yourself. This isn't just the one-off to get the abilities that you want. This character is an archetype of the world that you're playing in. So if you create this character and say, would I be surprised if I ran into someone just like this? And you say, yes, I would never meet anyone else like this. Then that's not a good MO, right? A good MO is someone that becomes part of your world. And so, for example, I added the Mountebank, which is a con artist, right? They're con artists in every world and every game and every story. This is something that enters into the world. If, however, I wanted to create the spellcasting con artist thief warrior, that sounds like something that is not going to come up very often. It's going to be incredibly rare. Now, I'm not saying a con artist or a spellcaster are common, but they are a normal part of your world. And so from that perspective, that's the first test to decide whether or not it makes sense. So one of the MOs that one of our players created was Daredevil. Now, they ended up, I think, going with circus performer. And they ended up having a few different areas that they were experts in. Performance was one of them. Agility was another one for their focuses. They started saying to themselves, like, what would your average circus performer know? What would they have? What would they practice? What would they learn as they were going along in their career? And so they started building out this Daredevil. Now, could they have just played a warrior because they wanted to throw knives? Yes. Would that have been as cool as an ex-circus performer on the run from a criminal organization? No, that would not have been as cool. That Daredevil who was on the run was way cooler and is something that could exist in the world over and over again. There's always going to be circuses. There's always going to be circus performers. And so the test of the MO right off the bat was spot on. The next test, though, is when you start talking about focuses and you start talking about specializations. And one of the most important things we've stated in here for you, which is the question, every blank can do blank. So where every, insert the name of the MO, can, and then insert the thing that you want to create as a focus or a specialization. So for example, every thief can cast spells. If that's the world that you're in, awesome. That should be a focus. Spellcasting should be a focus. But if it's not, and you don't think every thief can cast spells, then it's not a great focus. That's really a different MO. And you're talking at that point about a character who wants to have two MOs as opposed to a focus. And so that's the test that you go by. Now, I know some people are suspicious of things like this, going like, oh, people are going to abuse it. They're going to break it. It's not going to work. It's going to be unfair. Maybe this is a fault, but I believe in game masters and players to create the sort of game they want to play. I believe they know how to do it. We don't have to protect them from themselves. That's unnecessary, in my opinion. Now, do we want a completely broken system that doesn't work? No, we want a system that works great. But we can trust them with that framework to tell their own story. So, for example, maybe in one person's game, spellcasting thieves are the norm. Well, that's fantastic. That's your world. Go for it. Don't want to stop you from that. What I want to do is give people guidelines that allow them to create cool things for their world and for the type of game they want to play. And so I really believe in people. I believe in people's ability to use this stuff in a way that's going to be effective and fun in their game. All right. So let's just look at the MOs that are here, because we added a couple extra things to the MOs. So looking at the athlete, first off, we found a better way to list their information. So that was nice. But we've got the athlete, which is a MO in itself, because there are people who are professional athletes. This is what they do. They're not warrior athletes. They are runners. They are climbers. They are tossers. You know, I mean, the people who play in the Olympics, right? They're throwing the discus. These are the athletes who play the ball games in the Aztec cities. And so we wanted to be able to represent that in the game. Now, does a warrior do athletics? Sure, of course they do. They probably have endurance and running and hauling, but do they specialize in it? Maybe not. If they're going to specialize, they're going to specialize in a weapon. They're a warrior after all. And so athletes, again, we're looking at what they would likely specialize in. And if we said every warrior specializes in running, do they? Or do they just happen to stay in good shape so they can run and their specialization is in something else? Now, there are going to be people who disagree, and that's okay. You can change it in your game. It's totally fine. But so we got our athlete, we've got our focuses and our specializations, and then we have the new thing: weapons, armor, and defenses. Okay. Weapons. What we wanted to do was expand the weapons a little bit. In our early playtesting, what we found is that, sure, dagger, fists, feet, and clubs. Everyone can do that. You can add your MO when you attack with one of those. But immediately people were like, well, but like short bow is like a thief thing, right? Or hand crossbow is totally a thief thing, right? Wouldn't they be able to get a bonus on that? And of course, we allowed game masters to make that decision. But we also wanted to add a little bit of guidance that says, here's a weapon that this MO will probably know how to use. So for example, an athlete, they can already throw stones, so we don't need to have like shot put. But what about a javelin? That's a pretty normal, sports weapon for a medieval fantasy world. And so we've said, yeah, how about javelin? Let's give them javelin. They're good at throwing a javelin. They get their MO when they're throwing that, right? That's pretty cool. Armor. Let's take a look at this. If you're wearing armor that isn't on this list here, you have +1 to your difficulty scores for physical actions when you're wearing it. And that includes things of fine motor skills like, say, the gestures for casting a spell, because you'll notice the wizard is not going to have any armor listed. So they're probably not going to be able to cast a lot of spells, or it's going to be more difficult to cast spells if they throw on that armor. Now, we talked about things like adding a +1 for every level of armor above what you're allowed to wear. So if you have light armor listed, but you wear medium, it gives you a +1. And then if you wear heavy, it's a +2. It's another +1. So +1 +1 for each level you go up. we'll see about that. You guys can try that in your games too and see how it works. We're going to give it a shot. And so we listed a type of armor, though, that they know how to use well. And then we listed their defenses. And these are things that they get to add their MO to. Sorcerer, for example, can add their MO to dodge, which everybody gets dodge, but also to mind defense, right? We wanted to be able to have this idea that they can defend themselves better than, say, a warrior can on attacks against their mind. So this is something new that we've tried. There's not a hard and fast rule to this, except that we typically list a single weapon, a single piece of armor or something special that is appropriate, and then 1 or 2 defenses. Not a lot, very simple and straightforward. It's not a mathematical formula. And at the end of the day, it statistically doesn't make a huge difference. If one person has a couple armors and another person only has one, it all kind of evens out in the end. So that's the latest thing on the MO. So when you go to make your MOs, take a look, give it your best thought, and tell your story. That's the main thing I can encourage you is tell your story, because that'll guide you to create great MOs if you tell your story. And always ask yourself, can every blank do blank? And that'll help you as well along the way. And finally, remember the first thing we talked about with MOs, ask yourself if this package of skills is normal in your world. If it's not normal for a type of archetype of character, then it might be a little bit broad for an MO. So that's the end of that. At this point, I want to stop here and we're going to wrap some things up because we're going to talk about what's coming next. I'm very excited. We have a lot of very cool stuff coming up. First off, consulting designers are going to be getting some new quests soon, because up till now, everything's been just this framework stuff, right? So we've gotten some broad feedback from them, but now I'm going to be able to go to them and say, and I keep picking on DBJ for this, but I know he's got good ideas for the exploration encounters, and saying, here's the rules. How would you build a rule set for exploration? What would you do here? Or someone who's very experienced at skills and loves building out skill systems, looking at the MOs and saying, how would you tweak this? What would you do different? What would you change or improve or add to this? Now, some of these things may actually change the core rules. Some of the feedback will serve as the foundation for some of our rules modules in the rules expansion book. We'll see how that all turns out, and I'll share it all with you guys once we have it. But this is great because it puts us where we can start actually taking advantage of some of their areas of expertise rather than just sort of the broad questions that we've been asking so far. The other thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be having some contests. And one of the prizes, at least, we're going to be giving away some cool name goes here t-shirts as prizes, which I'm excited about. Those prizes are going to come in contests where we make encounters, or making new MOs, or creating new spells. We're going to have a number of contests over the next few months. And so watch the Discord and watch the Kickstarter page, because we'll be announcing them there. And we hope that you grab these rules and get involved and make some cool things to share with others. And of course, if we include what you build in the book itself, we'll list you as a contributor. So you'll actually get your name in the book in another place aside from just backer. So yeah, we're going to be doing that as well. And also emails went out today about all of our different focus groups and live Q&A sessions, and we're starting up on those. Like I've been telling people all along that once we got past this basic point, things are going to heat up fast and start really moving, because now we can really start to build. So I'm pretty excited about all the stuff that's coming along. And Gen Con games. Now, we are doing one game, which is sort of our celebration first event that we're going to run with our heroes of the hobby and with our ultimate publisher backers. But I'm also going to be running other games at Gen Con, and I'm going to be reaching out to ask folks, what's the best way to arrange these? Tell me if you're going to Gen Con, let me know. We'd love to hear about it on Discord, and we're going to set up some times to game with everyone while we're there. So I'm really looking forward to that as well. All right, folks, that's it. Talked your ear off. We've gone almost an hour again. Thank you for hanging out and talking to me about Cool Name RPG. I hope that your game goes great this week, and we will talk to you later. Have a good night.